Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Good day. It's great to see you again. Dr. Roberts and I would like to welcome you to In the Word, our weekly Bible lesson from the International Sunday School series. We're excited about starting a 4-week series from the Gospel of Luke. Luke's a delightful gospel with a wonderful angle on the person and life and ministry of Jesus. And so we're looking forward to spending a little time with it. Dr. Roberts, welcome.
Good to be back.
And it's good to be in Luke, isn't it?
It is.
It's good to be in Luke.
Yep.
We're going to be focusing on a section of Luke that is very distinctive because it's, I started to say kind of unique. I think you're not supposed to say kind of unique, are you? It's either unique or it's not.
It isn't. Yeah.
It is. It has a lot of special material that only shows up in Luke's gospel.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Luke is rich with unique things that are only here.
Yeah.
In this particular passage, Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem.
Yes, in Luke chapter 9, verse 51 is where that quote comes from. And what it suggests to us is that from right in the middle of his ministry, he's already aimed toward Jerusalem, and we know what that means. That means the cross. Yeah. And so Jesus seems to have a consciousness of that crucifixion destiny that awaits him yet over a year off as he starts making a deliberate move toward Jerusalem.
And over half of Luke's gospel is this aiming toward the ultimate end.
He continues his ministry of teaching and healing.
Oh, his most familiar parables come in this portion.
Yeah, it's here that we meet the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son and people like that. He also uses this period to try to prepare his closest disciples for the reality of his upcoming crucifixion, even though they don't seem to catch on.
He talks about it, he anticipates, and they don't seem to get the clue.
Yeah. So this is a very distinctive section of Luke's gospel, much of which is not in the other gospels. And it also kind of lies under the back shadow of the cross in a fascinating way that helps us to understand it better. The overall series of lessons that we're in, 4 from Luke, and then we'll move to Matthew's Gospel, is entitled Discipleship and Mission. And that's an interesting title. If we take the Great Commission seriously, we realize that the purpose of disciples is to discipleize, right?
To make disciples.
To make disciples. And that's the mission part, I think. Yeah. So disciples are on a mission. My wife and I have a friend who is a missionary in England, and I was reading his missionary newsletter recently and noticed that he doesn't use the term Christians or believers to describe what I would call Christians or believers, and he doesn't just call them disciples, which is a wonderful term. He always calls them disciples on mission, hyphenated. Disciples on mission, which when I first read it, I thought, oh, that's kind of wordy, every time. Can't you just say Christians or whatever? But he very deliberately says disciples on mission. Yeah. And I've been kind of inspired by that and realized that discipleship and mission have to go together.
If we're following Jesus, he was on a mission, and he calls us to be on a mission.
Yeah. So discipleship and mission is our theme, and we'll kind of keep the Great Commission in the back of our mind. We're disciples who've been called to make disciples, just as Jesus were as well.
Luke's gospel is
let's talk about
really
Luke.
Significant. As far as we know, Luke is the only Gentile author in the New Testament. And again, he's referred to as Luke, the beloved physician, so presuming that That's the author. He's an educated person, and the grammar, the syntax, the style of the book indicates someone who is well educated. But there's a deep concern for the people who are left out.
Yeah. And we don't know if that comes from Luke being a Gentile and maybe feeling like a second-class citizen because the Jews look down on Gentiles. Maybe it comes from him being a doctor and caring for those in physical need and maybe in financial need. Or it may have been inspired by him being a believer and a follower of Jesus.
He was on mission with Paul
and
on his journeys.
So he's caught the vision of Jesus, which is that his life is for those in need, spiritual need, and others as well. As a result, this gospel is filled with fascinating stories about Jesus reaching out to the lowly and the lost, like the lost parables. And we also see Jesus confronting the high and mighty in that society and holding them accountable in a way that many people didn't. I always think of a section in Luke's gospel. He's referring to the ministry of John the Baptist, and he has this beautiful poetic section in which he says, the valleys will be filled up and the mountains and hills will be brought low. And I know that's kind of a physical description, but I think he means it humanly. Jesus was raising up the lowly, the valley people, but he was humbling the haughty people at the same time.
You find more concern in Luke's gospel for women, children, people who are often left out in that society and that culture. But at the same time, he's not leaving out people like Zacchaeus, who is very wealthy.
Yeah, as we're going to see in our lessons, in the lesson today, Jesus doesn't write off the rich or the powerful. He continues to reach out to them. It's just that he tries to counteract what had become kind of a Jewish way of thinking, that the rich and the powerful must be more pleasing to God because God had blessed them with those advantages, and that the poor and the sick must be disfavored by God because God had punished them. And Jesus is at great pains to say that's not the way to think.
Right, and that apparently was the dominant attitude of the culture. We find in John's gospel, when they came across the man born blind, the disciples are asking, well, who was the sinner?
Who sinned?
The man before he was born, or the family that they got a blind baby? And Jesus dismissed that, saying that's not the issue.
And when it's presented to us in stark terms like that, we say, well, how could anybody think that? But I think there's a lot of that Jewish attitude that still creeps into our thinking today, don't you?
There is. People assume that somebody who's suffering or somebody who's down and out, they deserve it somewhere.
As if it's something they had done. And whether it's something they've done or not, Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke, teaches us that compassion for the lowly and lost is the way of the cross, and that we need to look differently at wealth and power, not as blessings from God, but as potential problems and barriers to our spiritual maturity. Well, these are some of the things that are in Luke's gospel, and we're going to see them pop up in these next 4 lessons. So, well, today our printed lesson starts in Luke 14:7. Before you read it, let's set the stage, though.
The first 6 verses set the scene.
Jesus has gone to the home of a leader of the Pharisees.
He was invited to a meal on the Sabbath in the home of a leading Pharisee.
So this is a good example of how Jesus continued to relate to and reach out to the very people that he's holding accountable and sometimes criticizing. And it was there that he encountered one of the sick, a person with dropsy, which is actually the disease called hydropsy. Maybe we ought to describe what hydropsy.
Fluid retention.
Fluid retention, which causes terrible pain, often in the feet and lower legs. So this is a very debilitating disease, and Jesus is faced with having to make the decision: does he risk breaking Sabbath law by healing, that is, working on the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus, of course, goes ahead and heals him, even at risk of displeasing his Pharisee.
It's interesting, he raised the question to the people who were at the dinner,
Mm-hmm.
is it lawful on the Sabbath to heal or not? And they won't talk.
Yeah.
So he heals.
Yeah.
And
In
then
the past, other people had raised that question.
Yeah.
He jumps the gun on them, and he raises it first.
But they won't speak up.
No, they won't criticize
And so then
him.
he says, if you have a child or an animal fall into a ditch, you pull it out.
Right, yeah. Well, it's in the setting of that banquet that we get the teaching that we're going to study today.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, verses 7 and following of Luke chapter 14. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Then Jesus said to his host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous.
All right. Well, in this short passage, Jesus addresses and teaches two groups of people.
Mm-hmm.
First, he addresses the guests, that is, those who are called to a banquet. Mm-hmm. And then he addresses the host, that is, the one doing the calling.
Mm-hmm.
And we sometimes fit in one category and we sometimes fit in the other. So we get two lessons.
He's making sure
two lessons
we see it applies to
in
us.
the one here. Yeah. Let's talk about the actual physical setting of a banquet in Jesus' day.
Yes. We think of a table with chairs.
Yeah. So the places of honor, I think of as seats somewhere, but it's not. So
they
what should we?
reclined at table. The tables were lower, closer to the floor, and they would use cushions and lean on an elbow usually, and eat with one hand while they lean. And that's where you find the story of a woman washing Jesus' feet at the table. As a child, I used to think, how did she get to his feet?
Crawling around underneath the table.
But his feet were extended out.
Yes, toward the door, toward the outer.
And that's how, again, at the upper room, someone was, the disciple he loved, his head was near Jesus.
Yeah.
He was reclining next to him.
Right. And so the one, it said, reclining on his chest, all you would have to do is lean your head back a little bit and you'd be on the chest of the person reclining to your left. I will add that they always rested on their left elbow and ate with their right hand, is the other thing.
In Eastern culture, the right hand is the clean hand and the left hand is not.
Yeah. Okay, so now we all have the right picture of this banquet. They're reclining, not sitting.
The choice place was next to the host at the center, and then outward from that were the people of lesser importance.
Right. And so that would be kind of similar to a seating where you're sitting next to the host. It's just in that case you were lying, reclining next to the host. And he noticed that people were clamoring, according to verse 7, were clamoring to sit near the host, I guess. That would be the place of honor. It doesn't actually say honor there. It just says first reclinings. That's the literal word. First, in other words, the best places to lie at the banquet table. That's interpreted by the NIV translation as place of honor. Now, Jesus' response to what he's physically observing there is a parable. And let's talk about this word parable a little bit.
We think of a parable as a story always,
Yeah.
not necessarily.
Right, and we often assume that parable stories are what's technically called allegories, where almost every detail of the story can be matched up into the spiritual teaching. But not all parables are allegories. The word parable simply means a comparison,
Right.
a point of comparison.
The Greek word is throw alongside.
Yes.
So that you've got something to compare to.
Yes, so here's a physical reality. We're going to throw along a spiritual reality alongside it. And so sometimes, and that's the case here, there's one point of comparison that we need to take away from the story. The reason that we're talking about this is if you took this parable as a point by point by point by point allegory, it would lead to an incorrect teaching.
Exactly.
Because in the parable, Jesus says, you need to arrive at the banquet, pick a lesser seat, so that you will be invited to a better seat.
Right.
It sounds very manipulative, doesn't it?
It's exalting yourself by looking at the lower seat.
Yeah, so it's just a strategic version of self-exaltation.
Right. We joke about taking the back pew at the church with the idea that sometimes that's the choice seat.
Yeah, that's true. But either way, whether you're taking the place of honor or prefer the back pew, you're self-focused there. And Jesus' point is just the opposite. Yeah. So we're going to see the one point of comparison in this parable when we get to verse 11 here in just a minute. Well, parable is very important. By the way, the parable is about a wedding feast, which was a really big deal in that culture. Wedding feasts sometimes lasted a week, and people would come and share the hospitality of the family for a lengthy period of time. So this is a big deal. By the way, every time the word invited appears in this passage, which is frequently, it's the word called. So, you're called, which has some overlap into the concept of discipleship, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Called. And also resonates with the title of our lesson, Called to Serve, here. Although I wouldn't have called this lesson Called to Serve. I would have called it Called to Humility.
Right.
Yeah. Because that's going to end up being the point, isn't it? Well, shall we move to verse 11? Because that really is the point of the
theme of
this first part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And that emphasis is in contrast to what's promoted in our society much of the time nowadays, to make ourselves great by putting ourselves forward.
Yeah. I see a lot of signs around. You and I both taught at a college for many years, and it's very common for colleges to have the word something pride. Have you seen signs like that? And I've always hoped that the Christian college where we taught for many years, did not develop that habit. I
haven't seen it.
But I haven't seen it because pride isn't the point. I mean, I get you want to, you think well of your college, you think well of your university. I understand that, but for Christians, pride is something that we resist.
Just the thing, the pictures of people with a finger up, we're number one.
We're number one.
We're the first place.
Yeah.
That's not what Jesus is talking about.
Yeah. So this idea of humility is very key here in verse 11, and the difference. Do we exalt ourselves? Do we try to say I'm number one all the time, or do we humble ourselves? It's interesting to me that this word humility very frequently turned up in the list of vices in the general Greco-Roman culture of the day. It was considered a negative character trait to be humble, and it was considered the proper thing to be self-promoting.
Yeah. which
in that culture
is pushed in our society.
It is.
But Jesus was definitely countercultural when he talked about blessed are the meek and
oh yeah,
you know, love your neighbor, I mean your enemies and bless them, and that's just counter to their culture and counter to ours.
It is very counter to ours, where self-promotion and kind of an aggressive self-exaltation is considered a good thing, a positive thing. Now we're not advocating putting yourself down, are we?
It's not groveling in the dirt.
Right.
That's the idea.
Because you can't lift somebody up if you're putting yourself down. That's not the point.
When you're focusing on yourself, either way, you're missing the point.
Right. But humble attention to other people's needs is really a virtue in the Christian way, and it runs just directly counter to that culture in Jesus' day and to ours as well.
And in the second half of this passage where he addresses the host, that's where he really puts the emphasis on focusing on those people who are left out of society and not getting attention.
Yeah. In this first part, there is at least one other thing I wanted to mention. It's this idea of shame.
Humiliation.
Yeah, humiliation. And that comes out in verse 9. Then humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. It says at the end of verse 9. That word humiliated is the word shame. And sociologists have identified the Jewish culture of Jesus' day as an honor-shame culture, as many were, and many cultures in our world today are as well. African cultures and some Asian cultures,
Eastern,
big, strong on that. That's an interesting concept to me, that people would live their lives seeking honor, seeking glory, seeking to be honored, and that the opposite, the flip side of that, is to be shamed or to be put down or to be humiliated by someone else. It seems to me that the way of the cross is kind of a way that goes between that. We certainly don't seek shame for ourselves.
No. And yet the cross was a thing, a symbol of shame.
It was, but at the same time we don't seek honor. That's not the goal of our life. And to me, what Jesus says we seek is humility. That is a life that seeks to bless others.
Lifting others up.
Yes, that's oriented to that. Well, that does bring us to the second half. The first half was instructions by Jesus to those who are called to the banquet. And the second part is aimed at the host,
the one who calls.
The one who calls.
Yeah.
And you had already started well talking about how the emphasis here is not on inviting just those that we feel comfortable with or who share our social rank or whatever, but to deliberately look for ways to reach out to the marginalized and the needy. And this is a characteristic teaching of Jesus that's especially highlighted in the Gospel of Luke, isn't it?
It really is.
It turns up in other places as well.
But Luke, all the way through, seems to have an eye for the people Jesus paid attention to, who were the lowest part of society, even the thief on the cross.
Right.
It's Luke that brings that out.
It ends with the thief on the cross. It begins with the shepherds at Jesus' birth.
Right, yeah.
Right from the start, Luke is telling us stories about marginalized people. It was hard for me to realize just how lowly shepherds were in that culture, but they were. And Luke is the one who tells us that it was shepherds who were privileged with the good news of the birth of the Messiah. And
Luke spends more time talking about Mary, which the others don't pay that much attention to women.
Here, a pregnant, out-of-wedlock teenage girl.
Right.
How low can you get?
Yeah.
Now, it sounds in verse 12 like he's saying, don't invite. Well, it says, don't invite your friends.
Yeah.
Don't invite your relatives. Don't invite your rich neighbors. could that really be what Jesus is saying?
He doesn't mean to cut off relationships with your family and your friends, but don't spend so much time with them that you ignore the people who are left out in society.
Yeah, and who have real gripping needs.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, this story itself shows that would be a mistaken interpretation, because Jesus is at the home of a leading Pharisee at a banquet. So clearly this is a wealthy person.
Yeah.
So Jesus didn't cut them off, but he also reaches out to the poor, to the marginalized, to the sick, to women, to children at the same time. The list of people who should be invited comes in verse 13, and it's a kind of a familiar list.
It is.
Poor, crippled, lame, and blind. We see that in other places,
we find
don't
out
we?
the next parable he tells in Luke 14. The king having a banquet and people turning him down, and then sending servants out to look for anybody. The poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. The same list, the same order.
Yeah. And it's a little bit reminiscent of Luke's description of one of the very first sermons Jesus ever preached in his ministry. It comes back in Luke chapter 4. It's the sermon at Jesus' home synagogue in Nazareth, where he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, to give recovery of sight to the blind, release the captives." It's not the identical list, but the point is the same, that Jesus' messianic ministry has been to reach out to the disadvantaged, to the marginalized, to the needy, not to the rich, the great, the powerful.
Yeah. And as Christians, we still have that mission that Jesus has given us to see the people of need and to be concerned about them.
Yeah. And so here Jesus is teaching everyone in his hearing, but he especially tried to drive this point home to his disciples, that Jesus came to serve, not to be served. And if they're going to be his disciples, they need to follow that pattern. Luke's gospel tells us of a very sad thing that happened during the Last Supper. Just after the institution of the Lord's Supper, there was a dispute among his disciples about who was the greatest.
Still arguing about the greatest.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a sobering reminder to us that we still struggle with this idea of thinking that the life of discipleship is something oriented toward greatness, you know, that we need to become great or powerful or lofty or noble. And this story is a powerful reminder that humility and putting others first is the way of Jesus.
Yeah. And he's saying, don't worry about being repaid. That's not the issue.
Yeah.
And God will take care of you. Just, help people in need.
Yeah. That's good. Neither do we seek the lowest place so we can get the better place, and we certainly don't serve the needy just so we can be rewarded.
Right.
We follow Jesus into the way of service. Well, we had some good reminders today, didn't we? So glad you could join us for our discussion of this beautiful passage. We'll see some others similar as we continue our study of the Gospel of Luke. Hope you can join us next time with our next lesson. Have a great week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.